I've never understood the appeal of doing something and not measuring the impact of doing it. My goal in joining Slack was to build data infrastructure that Google engineers would be jealous of. The two places, and the only two places I think that it really makes sense to get started with data, are growth and performance. The question I get asked all the time is like, should I hire a data scientist? And the answer is no, you should not. There aren't that many good ones, and I need all of them.
Welcome to The Right Track, a podcast for people building data cultures. We will hear from leaders in engineering, product, and data as they share their frustrating and inspiring stories on building the best product for their customers by mastering outcome-driven development, self-serve analytics, and great data cultures. I am Stefania Ólafsdóttir, CEO and co-founder of Avo, the analytics governance platform, changing how developers, product managers, and data scientists collaborate to plan, track, and govern their product analytics. Keep the conversation going with us in the Right Track community. Join us on therighttrack.avo.app. In this episode, I spoke with Josh Wills. Josh has been around the block in his data career. He coined a commonly quoted definition of a data scientist as a person who is better at statistics than any software engineer and better at software engineering than any statistician, a definition I heavily relate to myself. He was the first director of data engineering at Slack and built Slack's logging infrastructure. He worked on Google's foundation for experimentation around ads. He is a self-proclaimed ex-statistician, now working as a software engineer, but stays close to the data space with flaming hot takes on Twitter and by angel investing in the tools he would have wanted back in the day. We discussed the role of a data scientist and whether that's a helpful title for anyone. We covered his learnings at Slack and how much of a difference it makes for a company's data culture when data producers and data consumers are on the same team working closely together. Or furthermore, when they are in fact the same person, which is rare. We also talked about what you can do and where to start to get buy-in for good data culture, whether it's at the genesis or when you are knee-deep in total chaos and want to make it better. Listen in for Josh's stand-up comedy and actionable insights from his life and trauma, I have to say, as a data person. Hello, Josh. Welcome to The Right Track.
Hi, Stef. Thanks for having me.
So honored to have you. Been following you for a while, and it's you always have good, juicy hot takes. One of my favorites is a pinned tweet on your Twitter profile, which is your thought from 2012, actually, on the definition of a data scientist, which I relate heavily to, which is great.
Yeah.
We'll probably touch on that later. I'll ask you to define that then and now. I think it's a long-lived definition.
Yes.
Josh the Prophet. Could you kick us off by telling us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and how you got there?
Sure. My name is Josh Wills. Right now, I am a software engineer at a company called WeaveGrid, and we do managed charging of electric vehicles for utilities. Like a lot of people, I had been feeling for a few years that like I should do something to work on climate change. And as a sort of historically a data person, it was tricky to figure out like what exactly I could do besides, like making coffee drinks for scientists, building batteries or something like that. But that's what I try to do at WeaveGrid now. Before that, I used to work at Slack. So I was at Slack for about 4 years, and I was Slack's first director of data engineering and helped build the team and a lot of Slack's very early 2015 era data infrastructure. Before that, I was at Cloudera, where I was director of data science and like talked a lot about this. Sort of was at Cloudera from 2011 to 2015, like going through kind of like the whole big data science hype cycle. I got to like live that whole thing. Went around and mostly like talked to people and told them like how to use Hadoop and how to do sort of, again, early pre-deep learning, machine learning and stuff like that. And before I was at Cloudera, I did 4 years at Google. I was hired actually as a statistician. My master's degree is in operations research, and Google hired me to be a statistician to kind of analyze their auction system, which is what I studied in grad school. But as soon as I got to Google, all I did was like write software. Like I never would have made it past a Google software engineering interview But as soon as I was in the door, there was nothing stopping me from writing software all the time. So I did, and it was great. And so I wrote a lot of software at Google, a lot of it for ads. I became very much enamored of Google's experimentation framework and experimentation culture. And so I wrote the Java version of Google's experiment library. It's still used today, which is crazy to me. I once asked a Google friend, there are still 6 to-dos with my name next to them in Google's code base. So I've been gone for 10 years, but I think if I go back, like that's the first 6 things I'll have to do. I should say there might be Google recruiters listening to this. I'm never going back. Never, ever, ever. Stop asking, leave me alone. And yeah, that's kind of me. I've been doing data stuff since when I graduated college in 2001, and I had like a 5 gigabyte database. That was huge in 2001.
Big,
that was a big deal. I had a lot of test data back from doing testing microprocessors at IBM. Yeah, that's me. I don't know. I've done some things, and then yes, the tweet, and I've given talks and stuff like that. And so yeah.
You profited the definition of a data scientist.
Yes.
This is still a hot topic. What defines?
Is it?
I think so, yeah.
It's funny. I mean, I wrote the definition because in that time in 2012 or whenever that was, there was this ongoing debate of like data scientists. Not a real thing.
Yeah.
All scientists use data. Like data scientists, a bunch of nonsense. What does that even mean? Or what is it? A data scientist is a statistician who lives in San Francisco. I think that was the other definition that was popular at the time. Yeah,
that's good.
Which was true. It was probably at the time. It was honestly probably a better definition.
For listeners,
yes.
Let's read the definition. I don't know if you have it top of mind. Would you like me to read it?
Oh God, would you read it for me? I try not to think about that thing so much anymore.
So, data scientist, a noun.
Yeah.
A person who is better at statistics than any software engineer and better at software engineering than statistician.
That's right. That was in the 140 character days. So like I put that end thing there to say I am defining something like a dictionary.
Yeah.
I only had 140 characters, and I think I used just about all of them. So yeah. That is a reference to a writer who was part of the Algonquin Roundtable, like in New York in the 20s, 30s, 40s, whatever name. I think his name was A.J. Liebling, I want to say. And he said as a writer, he was faster than anyone better and better than anyone faster.
Interesting.
Yes.
It'll take some digesting to take that in.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. And that was sort of how I thought of what it was to be a data scientist. It was like you are better at statistics than software engineers are, but you are better at software engineering than statisticians are.
Mm-hmm. As an input into that, I kicked my data science career off before it was called data science when I joined a genetics company. And I was hired as a statistician, and I spent the majority of my time writing software.
Yes, been there.
But would have never qualified for a software engineering interview. So
exactly.
I heavily relate to this definition.
Very much so.
However, also later when I was running data science at a company called QuizUp, it was something that I put a lot of effort into, asked everyone to read the book Clean Code and things like that. So we would at least be trying to build like best practices of software engineering, despite having no experience or knowledge of the subject.
Exactly. Google made me a software engineer. Like I said, I'm actually reasonably confident I still wouldn't pass a Google software engineering interview. But it was an amazing education. I studied like math and statistics and optimization and stuff in school. So I did like very little bit of programming here and there, but didn't really know what it was to be a software engineer until I got there. Yeah.
Yeah, a little known fact about mathematics is how little calculations you actually do.
Very little.
You're studying mathematics.
I say rarely ever interacted with a number, to be honest with you.
Exactly.
Like didn't see numbers ever, at least not the math I was doing.
Yeah, people, please stop asking us to calculate things quickly in our mind.
I know. Or like calculating the tip at a restaurant or whatever. It's like, I don't know. Just get a calculator. Leave me alone.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, if you have a differentiable manifold or something, I can help you out. But like,
exactly. Is this a group?
Yes, precisely. Exactly.
Awesome. So thank you for that intro, Josh.
Sure.
Do you think this definition of a data scientist still holds up?
I do. Yeah, I think it's still popular and still cited because, again, I don't know that anyone's done better job of expressing the idea in fewer characters, I guess. And so it's pithy. Yeah.
A little bird whispered to me that this has actually also been cited in official research papers.
I know it is actually cited in official research papers. I like most people, obviously I Google myself like all the time, and mostly my Google Scholar citations and stuff. So I do track these things for this. And when I was at Cloudera, my colleagues and I wrote a book about doing advanced analytics with Spark, and it still beats the quote for citations, but kind of pound for pound, like whatever citations per character, it's tough to beat. Yeah, exactly.
So I agree. Like, I think this holds up. Another follow-up question of that: do you think this is a helpful title for people? For job descriptions. Is it helpful for people to understand what your job is going to be about if someone is advertising for a data scientist?
I think it depends on is it helpful for the job seeker? It's helpful insofar as if they want to identify as a data scientist, to the extent that they, a lot of people's self-identity is wrapped up in their jobs and they want to be, a data scientist, then I think it's incredibly helpful for the people who are trying to hire people. Whether the title is actually descriptive of what your day-to-day life is going to be like if you have that title across a bunch of different companies, well, probably not so much, I think, talking about like more like the modern data stuff, right? Like the new data scientist title is analytics engineer.
Yeah.
That actually is useful because it's like if you're an analytics engineer, well, you're going to be building models in DBT. That's what you're going to be doing. It's a title everyone wants, and it's actually descriptive of what you do. Data scientist, title a lot of people want. Descriptive, probably not.
I think one of the challenges is like there are a lot of people that want to become a data scientist, and then they join a job, and the expectation versus reality of what you.
It's a blow.
Yeah.
It's a blow. Exactly. It was better. It was better for us, Stef, back in the day before the title existed, when it was just like it was kind of like, listen, I'm going to be a statistician, but I'm really just going to write code all the time. That's what I'm actually going to do, right?
I think also maybe another way of how that has changed over time is like back in the day when we were starting off. I think the shaping of what companies were actually looking for in a role like that were just so short along, if you could say that.
Yes.
And so we had the opportunity to just like shape it.
Absolutely. I remember I actually had this happen in I first interviewed for Google. We should have a whole separate podcast stuff, like my various terrible career decisions. I first interviewed at Google in 2005. And I interviewed with the woman who eventually became my boss, who's Diane Tang, who is Google fellow and is like the hands down best boss and most badass engineer I think I've ever worked for. And she interviewed me back in 2005, and she's like, I don't like. I'm looking at your resume, and like, are you like a software engineer or a statistician? And I was like, well, like, why can't I do both? Like, I'm not sure. I like to do both. Can I do both? And she was kind of like, yeah, sure, you can do both. Okay, come work at Google. And I was like, 2005, Google's stock price is like, I think it's like $150 a share. That's way overpriced. That's way and like search, who's going to need that? Like anyway, yeah. Passed on that job offer, and she was kind and took me back a couple of years later after I realized my mistake. But anyway, yeah.
And it wasn't too late.
That's right. It turned out to be fine.
Yeah.
But I think the first title for like equivalent at Google was like it was decision engineer or something like that, which in a different world maybe that would have been the data scientist title. It could have been decision engineer. That's actually like that's not terrible, right?
Yeah, I agree. So I want to ask you the classic question that I like to ask all of my guests.
Sure.
Could you tell us an inspiring data story and a frustrating data story?
I think I think back to my younger. This is all like the old timey back in my day kind of podcast. I remember being first exposed to experiment driven development at Google, where like places I had worked before, smaller companies, we did like analysis. We would analyze data and like do simulations or projections or whatever, and we would try to figure out what was going to happen and try to figure out like, is this idea any good? Should we invest in this or not or whatever? And then, when I got to Google, I started doing that for the ad auction that I worked on. I was like, okay, I'm going to run this simulator. I'm going to replay millions, billions, trillions of auctions and like under different rules and kind of see what we think would have happened and make all these assumptions and stuff like that. And I'm doing this work. And then like this, one of the more senior engineers on my team kind of takes me aside and is like, you could like spend, all these weeks and like thousands, millions of computer hours running these simulations. Or we could just like implement the idea and just run it as an experiment on like, 1 million users or whatever, and just kind of like see what happens. And we have all this machinery built to like automatically analyze the experiment and compute confidence intervals and calculate all these metrics and all this kind of stuff. And like, you can just do that. At Google, the rule at the time was like, if you could convince one other engineer that your idea was worth trying, that was all that was required to run an experiment on 1 million people. That was it. And it was amazing, Steph. It was an absolutely amazingly wonderful way to work. I loved it so much. Like, it's cheesy to say, but like the democracy aspect of it was delightful. And so many, like, obviously there were tons of terrible ideas that went nowhere, right? But so many great ideas that no one would have thought of or considered or whatever, right? But just try it and see and just find out. And everyone is like equal. No one's analysis gets a better. It's all like the whole system is automated. It's there for everyone. It was great.
The data speaks for itself.
Yeah, it was great. And I think whenever you are working in environments where like data is like basically directly turns into money, and that can be fraud. It can be like obviously ad tech, a lot of recommendation stuff, any of these kinds of things where it's just really obvious connections. That's how you work. It's not about politics. It's not about blah, blah, blah. It's just about, does it work? This is how we measure it. We do it the same for everybody. That's it. That's the rule. And I loved it. It was great. And I wanted more than anything, I think, after doing it for a few years, I wanted everyone to have experience with like working like that. I wanted it to be that way everywhere. So that's the kind of the inspiring story. The disappointing story is the rest of my career, where I regularly like failed to actually do that. Like really anywhere else I've been. Like,
oh my goodness.
Yeah, I try.
What you said about the experimentation is it's a really beautiful framing, actually, and it's a notoriously difficult thing to plan and estimate software delivery.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I gave that some thought like a while back, and obviously continuously it's a thing that you notoriously always think about, like, why is this so difficult?
Yeah. Especially if you're like the CEO of a company, it's especially frustrating.
Yeah. So I started comparing it a little bit with like the process of building a dam, for example.
A dam, okay.
Or some sort of a huge operation where there's no undo button. It's just like you build it and it fails or succeeds. It works or it just breaks and it's disastrous. And so that's why you don't build dams before, like a 15-year planning process. But this is in fact the beauty of building software. There are undo buttons, and of course, if you make the wrong bets, it might cost you things. It might cost you revenue and like people getting frustrated and things like that, or your customers get frustrated.
Yeah.
It has cost, but it doesn't have this extreme cost of like no undo button.
That's true.
And I think like the experimentation mindset is sort of also a symptom of this opportunity that we have in software. Like, yes, we do this because we can.
Yes. And I really got to live that. I like once personally cost Google about $2 million with a bad experiment I launched that like essentially disabled the ad system for a few hours. And I never forget the VP, whatever, like kind of took me aside and it was like, what lesson did you learn from the $2 million we just spent to like teach you, right? Whatever. It was great. I cost Google tens of millions of dollars in the process of making them hundreds of millions of dollars. And it was just part of the culture and it was fantastic. It was just so freeing. It was so fun. Mm-hmm. Back in the day. Oh, well.
Back in the day.
It's been a long time since then. Yes.
All right. So do you have any frustrating data stories top of mind? Specifics?
So many frustrating data stories. I mean, where to begin? So many frustrating data stories. Let's see. I sort of did this stuff at Google for a while. And then, I left Google kind of when Google was getting into like Google Plus and social and stuff like that and kind of relentlessly chasing Facebook. And this guy I knew named Jeff Hammerbacher, who is, to tie this back to the first thing, is the person generally attributed with coining the term data scientist, was working at a company called Cloudera, and he and I were friends and we would go to baseball games together. And he kind of like was like, in the way that all relationships in San Francisco are somewhat transactional and we're always trying to hire somebody or invest in somebody or whatever. he just kind of asked me point blank, like, do you actually care if Google or Facebook is like the dominant social networking company in the world? Like, does that actually matter to you in, in any way? And I was like, no, actually, come think of it, I don't actually care. So I went to Cloudera to work on something I did care about, which was, making it possible for everyone in the world to work with data the way that we worked with it at Google. That was something I cared about. And so I did that for a few years. It's hard, it's like I'm effectively doing like developer relations stuff. And so you're evangelizing and you're promoting, and it's great and it's very rewarding. And I'm grateful for having done it. At the same time, like I'm flying 125,000 miles a year. You're always kind of removed from the work. Like you're just advising people, you're consulting, but you're not like really like owning it and stuff like that in any kind of way. So it's hard to feel the impact. And then when my son was born, I really just wanted to stop traveling kind of altogether. And so I went to Slack to build. I think I've said this before, like my goal in joining Slack was to build data infrastructure that Google engineers would be jealous of. Like that was my goal, right? That was,
I like that.
yes, my revenge driven kind of product development philosophy, which is not great for various reasons, but nonetheless, that I wanted to go do this again. I wanted to build stuff. I was tired of talking about building stuff. I wanted to get back to building stuff. And it's a tough one for me, Stef. It is. It's a hard one. Like I'm very proud of like 85% of the decisions I made and the team made building Slack's data infrastructure. I made, again, a small number of absolutely terrible, horrible decisions that still inflict pain and suffering on everyone in Slack to this day because I'm not perfect and stuff like that, right? And I think there's no shortage of these people on Twitter. Like you can easily just go ask them. I think it's actually the genesis of this conversation was a whole thread about logging and like mistakes I made at Slack. They'll obviously never forgive me for, but that's fine. But building data infrastructure is not sufficient to create a data culture at the company. You can build the world's greatest data infrastructure, but if it's just the company's not there yet, if it's not time, if you don't have the people in place, if it's not top of mind, whatever, it's just not going to happen. And I didn't understand that. I was very much in the like, if you build it, they will come kind of mentality. And it's just not true. It doesn't work that way.
The world's worst myth for any founder.
I mean, so true. I mean, very much so. Very much so. And so the hardest thing for me was like, I killed myself for a couple of years building this stuff and was so burned out and was so drained and was so tired of fighting and was honestly not a great middle manager or anything really, kind of like it was just horrible that I left. And the nice thing was Keith Adams, Slack's chief architect, said something to the effect of Josh is far too good of an engineer to be wasted in management, which was a nice way to say it, that I was, not a very good manager. But nonetheless, I think what was hard for me was Slack did eventually become the data-driven company that I had always hoped that it would become. But it happened kind of after me. And it's like the same thing in startups, like being too early is the same thing as being wrong, And so it's this bittersweet thing for me. Like I'm very proud of everything the team did, but will always forever be somewhat sad that I couldn't really be a part of it in some way.
Yeah, to reap the benefits of what you had sort of really got good foundation for, though.
Indeed, but that's the way it goes.
Yeah.
Such is life.
I personally relate a little bit to this feeling after having built the data science division at QuizUp. It was a 3-year period, and I'm likewise very proud of all of the work that we did. I definitely did get to see some of the benefits, but the company was acquired and I started working on other things sort of exactly around the moment where it would have just been like a really sweet sailing type of thing.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, wow, we've built something so cool and it's going to be so much fun to participate in that. Thank you for sharing this. This is a really great story.
Sure.
And I think, and I hope actually it's an inspiration, because I think this is a shared experience for many people that are the first employee, first data person, founding analyst or founding data engineer role type of thing.
Absolutely.
At a company that is learning and going through a transition of sort of wanting, there's someone at the company high level that wants to be more data driven, but the organization hasn't really learned how to.
Exactly. I feel like I should just become like a therapist for these people, like full time. You know what I mean? Like it's actually probably, but I'm not sure I could like take that much like psychological like pain and stuff on a regular basis. And it's just I get together with like old Slack people sometimes for like breakfast and stuff, and it's kind of like, God, it's great seeing y'all, but oh my God, is it horrible talking about this stuff? Like I just don't. I do not enjoy this at all. Yeah.
You're triggering me.
I am so triggered. I have blocked this out, and you are making me remember it.
Yeah, we should start a therapy sort of agency type of thing, you know.
Some kind of safe space for this. Yes, exactly.
And this is literally one of the things that drove me to start Avo.
I can only imagine. I mean, it seems like no better way to like therapeutically work through your pain. Or you could be like me, Stef. You could just like angel invest in people who are fixing it for you, and like then you don't even have to think about it.
That's coming up next.
Okay, good. I'm so glad.
No, but literally it was I had a post-traumatic stress disorder trigger at a company that I started just after QuizUp.
Yeah.
And then later it was, I think, Christmas later that year, I just was talking to all of these people and everyone was just so depressed. And I was like, I can't have all of these people that we must be able to fix this. So
I feel like it's weirdly, you're making me like feel grateful about my current job, because there's nothing at WeaveGrid where I'm like, oh, I must go start a company to fix this. I don't feel that. Like things are, at least from the data infrastructure stuff, like things are actually like, they're pretty good. Like I'm just liking how things are going, and it's like pretty chill. And I'm like, yeah, this is all right. I'm okay with this. This feels nice. It's very soothing. I'm like, I'm in the good place. I don't know.
we've come a long way.
We really have. It's only been like 5 years really since it was just god awful terrible.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just so much better now.
This is actually a really good segue into, and we've already been touching on this, how the industry has been changing.
Yeah.
And I like to think about this in like a fairly short-term perspective, like just a 2-year type of thing. But obviously, we're also talking about, a more like a 7 and 10-year type of thing. So, would love to hear your perspective on how the industry has changed in the past years.
Yeah, it's funny. Like right after I left Slack in like November 2019, I did the Software Engineering Daily podcast, and Jeff asked me kind of the same question, and it was interesting because I was talking about like, well, the big news in like December 2019, before shortly before the world ended, right, was really Snowflake. It was like there's this thing called Snowflake, and it's like kind of super great, and it just works, and it like has solved all these problems, and it's awesome, and you can build around it, and all this cool stuff happens. And not for nothing, this is before Snowflake's IPO was like mega crazy, whatever, and like all the investor interest picked up and all this kind of stuff. I was just saying this was like things in the data world, pretty cool, like not so bad anymore. And so obviously all that happened. And then over like the last year though, I think it's the really exciting thing is like, because we have this plumbing now, because we have Snowflake as kind of the center of gravity, we're now starting to build like much, much cooler stuff on top of this underlying substrate, which is like fantastic and is the dream. And so really, like we were kind of alluding to it, but it's like, it's really like, for me, we have built this plumbing ingestion, like, again, it's Slack, ingestion, compute, visualization. We built all this stuff ourselves. We built our own version of Mode. We built our own Presto S3 data lake thing because we had to. There was, like whatever. We built our own ingestion system because we had to, right? Like all this crazy stuff. You don't only have to do that anymore. You can just like swipe a credit card and like Fivetran, Segment, Snowplow, Rudder Stack, Meltano, Airbyte, whatever you want. It's like, it's done. It's done. You configure it, off you go. Snowflake, you got as much compute capacity as you want. I tweeted the other day, I loved it. I was like, just the genius of Snowflake as a business, making it possible for anyone who has a question to just throw as much money and compute power as they want at that question. That's unbelievable. That's a license to print money. It's ingenious, right? Anyway, and then the visualization side of things, like Looker, Mode, like even Tableau, like bless their hearts, has finally kind of gotten with the program and is building better product. Like it's just like we've got the end to end. Like you can just wire this up, and it's fairly standard, well understood. Problems are largely solved, and now we get to start building on top of that, and we get to start like And again, where I'm super excited about DBT is my proudest angel investment by far, as like the core semantic layer where you can buy. Or like just use open source DBT packages that implements stuff on top of the Stripe data API that you pull in from Fivetran or like whatever. This is all just done for you, and you like there's just the community is great. Data community has honestly always been great. It's always been awesome, but it's just like that much better now and stuff. And so yeah, I'm excited to see this emerge, and I can't wait to see how this percolates out through like ingestion all the way through visualization at the end. Like this is the dream. And again, it's I think back to like when I started doing this stuff, like in the late '90s, when like you had to pay Teradata like an enormous amount of money for this box that had like limited capacity and stuff. And like, God, kids these days, I tell you, Steph, they have no idea how good they have it, right?
That's right.
It's just fantastic. You take these sort of layer underneath you and infrastructure for granted now, and you are just mostly confronting the problems of building the semantic layer, and it's hard and stuff. And we still spend plenty of time on Twitter shit posting about it, but nonetheless, we're just in a vastly better place. And it's just so great to see.
Yeah, I totally agree. Obviously, this is super exciting to see all of these changes happening, and particularly what you're saying about like we have the plumbing now, and now it's time to also start finding ways to make the other schlaps of our lives easier, which is
Yes,
also exciting.
absolutely. It's just absolutely so cool.
So on this note, I definitely also want to talk a little bit about like how you think data culture is changing and how the industry is changing with like organizations, and we'll touch on that a little bit later because I think with all this accessibility and making our lives easier, I wonder what you think about probably one of the most common statements you ever hear: I don't trust this data. And how is this changing with all of
Yeah.
this? Why do people not trust data? Why do people say this? How do we solve it?
Yeah. Why do people say that? I was talking to the head of data over at Convoy a few weeks ago. Chad Sanderson is great. We were talking about like the metrics layer and stuff like that. So there's the new companies that, again, part of this whole semantic revolution, building metrics and stuff like that. And Chad said the consequence of the fact that like our data infrastructure and our plumbing is so good is that it is cheaper for me to come up with my own metric or ask my own question directly of the database than it is to invest the time and cognitive energy in understanding your model and your definition of daily active user and your definition of blah, 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 right? Like it's just too cognitively intensive to do it. And so I'm better off just asking my own custom bespoke special Snowflake question. Like this is a consequence of the stuff being so good. We now have this like new weird problem as a result of it being so good, right? And I think that's kind of like what you see here and like the data culture stuff is like this is the problem we're addressing right now is this kind of this fragmentation and the executive team at like these data oriented companies being like, why are there 16 different definitions of DAU for like every part of the company? Like what the hell is going on here? From a data culture perspective, if you're talking about companies that have already like that have a data culture and that do stuff around data, that I think is the most interesting kind of problem right now and most fascinating consequence of this. And it's just neat to see the ways in which folks are approaching and solving it and stuff. If you're talking about like kind of the genesis of data culture, of how does a company transition from like the early stage vision driven, just crank on the feature to like the Google Facebook end state where everything is an experiment and like we experiment on everything all the time, right? That's a fun one. And that's a whole sort of separate thing.
I totally agree. Like a huge reason why people don't trust the data is that they don't have transparency into what the data actually means.
And all the different layers of like where did it come from and what transformations have been applied to it and like who did that and yeah, exactly. All of that is kind of invisible these days. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that you've hit a really interesting point there, or Chad hit a
Yes.
really interesting point there,
Yes, he did.
saying that it's easier for us now to just try to go to like the premise, the prerequisites of the world, and like
Yes.
what can I build on top of that to answer my question. But it causes another problem, which is like now I am seeing a bit of like conflicting results for where we stand with our go to market or something like that. So
That's right.
it's really interesting. I would love to hear that perspective of data trust from you as well, because I know you built a lot of infrastructure at Slack around the logging.
Yes,
And
we did.
there are so many different teams that work on that, obviously, because every product team needs to think about what they implement for their product. And it's quite difficult to get that unified across everything. Can you maybe talk a little bit about like that as well?
Yeah, so I guess what it's funny, like when you asked me the question, we were just talking about like modern data semantic stuff. And so I immediately went to this, like, even if you get to the point where you have the underlying data in the same place, maybe I don't trust the cognitive, infrastructure that's been built on top of it. Like that's the part I don't trust. Then there's the problem of like, I don't actually trust the data you generated. Like I don't trust the source of this or the provenance. I have no idea where this came from. Like I didn't do this. And yeah, I want to tie this around to like the companies making the journey to getting started with data, right? The two places, and the only two places I think that it really makes sense to get started with data, are growth and performance. This is kind of like the core. Any company you have anywhere ever has growth problems. They need to drive revenue, and they have performance problems because computers are terrible, software engineers are bad at their jobs, all that kind of stuff, right? And then also, if you're lucky, sometimes you have a machine learning problem, and then you have a machine learning team, right? And for the performance engineers and the machine learning engineers, I kind of think the sort of data, I don't trust this data problem is easier, if only because almost always the person who generates the data is the person who consumes the data. The person who wants to understand the performance problem or build the machine learning model does the logging and the instrumentation to get the data they need to understand the performance problem, right? And they understand the problem. They understand how the data was generated. They know what they want to do with it. If it doesn't conform to their expectations, they have, again, a good prior, like all this kind of great stuff. So they have all this sort of, again, I need to think of a catchy data science definition for this sort of cognitive superstructure I keep talking about, like that clearly deserves some pithy little whatever. So that's great, and that solves a lot of these problems of like trusting the data. The growth team, though, it's probably not necessarily the case. Like the person doing the instrumentation, doing the front end logging, doing like all this kind of stuff is probably not the data scientist who is going to be analyzing all this stuff on the back end. And so you have this crazy disconnect between these two worlds, and inevitably, and it's just kind of a bad situation, I think, generally, when the person who generates the data is not the person who consumes it, or like vice versa, And that's really where you need like a whole process and system to manage this relationship, be very explicit about things, make it easy to visually confirm that the log event is in fact the log event that I thought it was, and all that kind of stuff, right? So in performance and growth, performance/machine learning, you have one kind of data culture where I don't think data trust is that big of a problem. And then in growth, which is arguably more important than performance, really, for almost all businesses, you have the problem in it, like to the nth degree, like massively, especially when you're talking about like product-led growth in these days. Like your whole growth strategy is really around instrumentation as a product. It's a massive thing. And without some structure, process, tooling, it's just basically impossible. Like it just kind of can't be done.
Incredible. So we're talking about this in the context of data trust, but it's also just such a fundamental piece in how different teams view data.
Yes.
So when your job description is a software developer and you build products, and then you typically also work, or at least you touch base a little bit with a growth team or a product manager whose job is also to be a data consumer. Mm-hmm. And here you're framing fundamentally how important it is for data producers and data consumers to work closely together.
Yes.
I remember you talked a little bit about, in a previous conversation we had, about sort of the different teams at Slack, for example, and how this worked for them.
Yes.
Can you maybe talk a little bit about like how did these teams where the data consumers and the data producers did not maybe share a room or a Kanban board or a goal
or a literally a head, like literally ideally like they share like a brain.
Exactly.
Like the consumer and the producer were exactly the same person. This was the ideal.
Exactly. And that's not going to be realistic for so many situations, like for them to literally share a head. But how can we solve this particular part of the problem for the teams that don't share a head between the data consumer and the data producer?
It's a great question. I think there's two sides to it. There's like the process side of it, and then there's kind of like the incentive side of it. And I think one of the unfortunate consequences of my stint in engineering management is I'm always thinking about like incentives and promotion processes for engineers and stuff as I think about things, because I spend a lot of time thinking about this for growth teams, right? So process wise, you really can like, I think it's a fair point that like as I think about like Jira or whatever, it doesn't have like a great way, I think, of representing like the logging task correctly. You know what I mean? Maybe there's a way of doing this and I'm just not good enough at Jira. But like at Slack, we just have like a spreadsheet, right? And it's like we're developing this feature. within the kind of like logging, evolvable logging framework that I developed at Slack, the clogs and the slogs and all the kind of unfortunately named thrift schemas I had, there would just be a list of like, these are the events we're going to create. These are the fields we need for each of the events. This is where they have to happen in the code. And it's basically like a checklist. And we developed, like, again, it's like a PR, like a ticket, like anything else. You develop the feature, you do the logging for the feature kind of in line for it, and then we test it, have dev tools to help support it, logging, unit testing to make sure the logs are coming in correctly, like blah, 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 blah. And then downstream of that, we start building it. And I think the growth team at Slack developed this process through like the painful process of like not having this process. And one actually kind of situation I remember was like absolutely disastrous was with the, and Stef, I know you'll appreciate this, was like when you're at a high growth company, every, I don't know, 3 to 6 months, there's some kind of crisis. And so like your time there is largely defined by crises. And so at Slack, at one point, there was the mobile app crisis. I don't really know how to describe it. Like it was a fairly classic thing. They did some engineering reorganizations where they broke up the kind of dedicated mobile development teams and they embedded them in all the feature teams that did web stuff as well. And this is like a very common idiom. And the consequence of this was that like the core mobile code base basically went to shit because no one was responsible for maintaining it anymore. And then after like a period of months, like the whole app was just like an absolute disaster. And so they declared a fire drill. And our mobile logging stuff had, for reasons that are, whatever, organizational, political, engineering, whatever, did not have our kind of good, like schematized logging. It was just like JSON lawlessness, basically. And so it was this like absolute frantic disaster to like instrument this thing as fast as possible and like get the app out there and stuff. And oh crap, we put a typo in here. And oh no, we camel cased it here versus here. And like, no, what have we done? And yeah, it was just the worst possible situation because it's like the data scientists, the data engineers are working on like the highest priority, total visibility in the company, and the data is just terrible. And you got the problem of like, well, once the app's out there, it's out there forever. We need to live with these logs for basically eternity, right? Yeah, it was just horrible. And I think, it's the kind of thing, Steph, where like there's not really rewards for like solving these problems ahead of time, but like when you come after the disaster and after you see the terrible and you come up with like, this is the process and this is the system and now we have schemas and there are types and everything's going to be fine and we're going to test it all. Like that's the hero. That's the true. Anyway, the tooling was like, okay, it wasn't great. We had developer experience engineers, but we didn't have like one dedicated to making the logging system better for the growth engineers. And so you can have all the process you want, but bringing this back to the incentives, like doing the logging is not like super fun for like the front end engineers. This does not spark joy. They're not getting promoted because they did like more logging better and stuff like that. Really, like you get promoted for, developing good tooling or making stuff super cool or doing like neat front end stuff. And, sadly, like doing the logging is not that. And so it's like we have to have a process and we need a process and the data is important and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, it's like it's hard to make it ever really as good as like the pure joy and happiness of the machine learning engineer or the performance engineer who's like in their loop, doing their thing, thinking about how they're going to analyze this data as they're creating it. Like, it's the best. It's the best step. It's tough to beat.
Yeah.
And I'm asking you, like, how do we solve this? Like, how do we spark joy? Like, how do we make this fun?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So one of my favorite things to see when I'm working with organizations is the transition from developers seeing analytics as a task to be done that has nothing to do with the end user into seeing it as one of the fundamental tools that they have so that they can build better products for the customers that they are serving.
Absolutely.
And this, I think, is a lot to do with like creating a loop where they are part of product decision making and product strategy in some way. And they see that the impact that they have made by ensuring that, we have proper understanding of how customers are using the things that they built.
That's right.
And they see the impact of that applied to how do we decide on our next steps.
That's a leap for a company too. I mean, that's a leap for a company going from a what do you mean? We don't have OKRs. We don't have metrics. We just like ship features. That's what we do. And that's kind of what you're talking about. It's not just about, I agree with you. Like that's a leap. But, again, I lived through that transition at Slack, and it was, unfun.
Mm-hmm.
It was a bummer.
Mm-hmm.
The engineers, again, like the certainty of like, I will get promoted if I ship features. I don't actually care about the impact of the features. Like, I'm going to get promoted if I ship features and stuff. And like making that transition to like, no, you get promoted for solving problems, not for shipping features, right? That's
Exactly.
The two are not one and the same. That's a fun one. Ooh, no amount of money you could pay me to go through that again. Don't even like thinking about that. Yeah.
It's interesting. Like one of my favorite metrics is literally for seeing the cultural impact, just the team impact of transitioned data culture is literally just the conversion rate of developers looking at charts or asking data questions as a follow-up of them building something.
Totally, 100%.
And it's really interesting. Like, I think one of the fundamental mistakes I often see organizations do is like they try to do this as an organizational change for the entire organization, as opposed to try to start and like you're saying, like try to, exactly. Yeah. They try to build like, now we have an OKR, so we have to measure all of the OKRs versus just like, hey, we have a bet in mind and we want to just check that out. And then you get a full closed loop and a case study for the rest of the organization for like 3 or 4 people, and they're happy.
Totally. I give Slack credit for that. They did roll out OKRs kind of team by team, and it was an evolution and stuff. But it was also a thing that was told that was coming, and it was met by some degree of dread, I think. Mm-hmm. For reasons, again, I understand, but disappoint me. I don't know. I've worked with a lot of companies when I was at Cloudera, and it was always fascinating to me to see in whatever industry I worked in, what did people actually care about? And this is where, like, I don't know if I can say this, but whatever. Like, the nonprofit industry is in many ways the absolute worst about this, where for a lot of nonprofits, when I talk to them, it's very clear to me that they don't care about measuring the impact of what it is they're trying to change. They care about making the impact look good so they can get more donor money. That's what they actually care about. And it's like very disheartening to find that a lot of places. A lot of industries where like the incentives are not at all aligned with actually like changing the problem. And that's kind of the same thing we're talking about here. It's like when you're talking about shipping features, you're basically assuming that these features are going to solve the problems the features are intended to solve, and that someone else has done the process and is like an all-knowing oracle who can just predict ahead of time that, yes, if we ship this feature, it will solve all of our problems and stuff. And like, obviously, and that's just like not true for anyone ever under any circumstances, right? And so I've never understood the appeal of doing something and not measuring the impact of doing it. And maybe this just makes me too much of an engineer. Like, I don't know. Why would you do anything if you weren't like concerned about measuring the impact of it? Like, what is the point?
Exactly.
Like, what are you doing? Well, I'm going to ship the next feature that we need to solve the next problem. Like, but that, how do you know? Yeah, because they said it would. It's
exactly. This is a really good point about, and I want to tie this together with like the experimentation, the evolution into being an experimentation organization.
Yes.
And I think like trying to close the loop on not even with an experimentation, just like some simple way of measuring, did we see without too much over engineering for the first iteration? Like, don't adopt an A/B testing tool for your first thing that you want to measure.
Of course not.
Just like, did someone convert to doing the thing that we wanted them to do? And like, do the people who do convert to the thing that we just built, do they maybe do something else now in the product as well? And just be like a little bit retroactive in that. And I think that is a really good birth into being an organization that wants to make or sort of be a little bit more experiment driven.
Yes, it is. And I think, the thing I console myself with, Stef, and it's like kind of like the bittersweet aspect of doing the Slack experience, is that all companies reach this point. They always do. They have to. If they don't reach this point, they go out of business or they get acquired by somebody, right? They all have to reach this point. Getting there is messy and hard and is different and for everyone and stuff like that. But yeah, I used to start by asking, under what conditions would we roll this back? we're doing this thing.
Right.
Under what would have to happen for us to like say, oh God, what have we done? Like, let's roll this back. And if the answer is nothing, there's nothing we can like, this is the right thing to do, period, full stop. There are no circumstances under which, signups could go to zero. We don't care, right? Like whatever, this is fine. Okay, like then do it and don't measure it, right? It doesn't matter. But as soon as I find that at least at Slack, I had a lot more success, and I've talked about this a few times, is like framing experimentation and metrics in the early days as a de-risking mechanism, like not as a North Star. The North Star is your vision, product manager, CEO. That's the North Star. What does productivity feel like to you? That's the true vision. I'm sorry, I'm sarcastic now. I'm making fun. What's bad? What would badness look like? How would we know if something was bad? How would we know if like things had gone off the rails? That's actually like think of it as like it's an insurance policy.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a North Star. It's not going to replace your decision-making ability. It's an insurance policy. It's a check. It's a way of confirming.
It's a regression
measuring tool. It's that. It's safe. It's not threatening. It's like totally fine. And I've found I was like a lot more success with that. And hopefully none of those product people will hear me saying this. This is the gateway drug to the purely metric OKR experiment-driven world that I'm going to pull them into kicking and screaming. That's okay. They can always go to the next company. They'll just go work at the earlier stage company and they'll be happy. It'll be fine. But I do think it's the way. I do think it's the safe place to start, I think, for a lot of data teams.
I totally agree with it. And even, because it's not only always about starting the experimentation culture, it's also about what you're identifying and talking about right there is not all things that you build are necessarily, you don't necessarily have to measure them as an experiment.
Of course not. Absolutely not.
Back in the day when I was facilitating a lot of purpose meetings, as we called them, there was like a way to bring the data consumers and the data producers together and talk about like, hey, okay, what's the goal of this release here? Well, based on that, we should probably measure this and this and this. Okay, based on that, we probably need this and this and this data point.
Yep.
I would typically throw in for the developers that obviously had objections about like duplicating their code base for an A/B testing purpose, and they just wanted to iterate on the code and just ship things.
Yep.
And I would typically try to just leave it up to them and say like, okay, cool. I mean, are we concerned that our day one retention goes down because of this? Or is that, and if they were, it would be their estimation.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. So on this note,
yes.
I think you talked about the growth team's challenges, and we've touched a little bit on like data culture and how org structure impacts it.
Yeah.
And we talked about, being the founding data person and all those things and how that should and can evolve. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about like how the org structure evolved at Slack and what were or at any, company that comes to mind for you for this, and how you think like potentially what was a good example of a team that managed to do this well for like getting data to work with product, and how could they maybe have done things differently if it wasn't good? Yeah,
totally. When I think of the companies that did this well, and I don't include Slack as one of the companies that did this well. I think generally when I give people advice, like I can't tell you what to do. I can give you detailed instructions on what not to do. I think of Airbnb as a company that actually, in my perception, got data right, at least organizationally, for a long time. And again, they made mistakes and they had pain and suffering along the way because that's just life, right? Stripe also probably qualifies by this metric, and I don't think it's a coincidence. These are both remarkably successful companies. You can think of this like actually with early Facebook and early LinkedIn too. And the thing that all these things have in common was there was a person there early in the company, deeply trusted by the founders. I'm thinking of like Riley at Airbnb, like my friend Michael Monopod at Stripe, DJ Patel, obviously at LinkedIn, Jeff Hammerbacher at Facebook, where they had a strong relationship with the founders. DJ because they were all at PayPal together, Jeff because he and Mark went to Harvard together, blah, 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 right? A lot of trust there, like a lot of delegation to that person, a lot of executive support, like 100%, right? To build a strong and largely independent data organization within the company, and also not running like a business where was Airbnb with search, Stripe with fraud, Facebook with well, I guess ads, whatever it is, like where there's a significant data component, where being super good at data is deeply important to the company, right? These are kind of the conditions, I think, under which like data teams truly thrive for at least a while in this sort of independent function with that sort of strong executive support, right? Now, this is not most places. And like these are sort of magical conditions. Like you can't engineer this, right? You can't like put, the CEO and the data person in a math class together in college. It doesn't work that way, right? And so most companies don't come up this way, and Slack certainly didn't. And as a result, data at Slack was sharded across every organization. So the analytics team reported up through business operations, which is like finance and G&A and stuff like that. So again, you got to remember Slack's early and product-led growth. Like our billing system depended on product usage and like product analytics, because it was like you only paid for the seats you actually used. And so, okay, well, what does that mean, right? So the billing systems, the ARR, the MRR, all this early stuff was all done by the data analytics team off of like read replicas of production data to figure out how to bill people, because like that was what you had to do. The marketing team had their own MarTech stack, which was all just for them. It was like a lot of third-party services and stuff like that, right? So anyway, and then obviously customer success needed lots of data because Slack was doing very early major investments in customer success, so they need all this data, right? And then when kind of things got big and out of control enough to the point that they like hired me and hired a data engineering team, the company's already like 250 people at this point. Well, I'm an engineer, and my title is director of data engineering, so I report up through the engineering hierarchy. And of course, the engineers need data too. They have performance problems and stuff like that they need to understand. So everyone needs data. And so when I looked at the org and I looked at all the customers I had for the data platform I was building, right? The only person all of these people have in common as a boss is the CEO of the company. And that's really tricky. If you find yourself in a position where you have like all these different customers and this is the only person they have in common, like you're kind of fucked. I don't really know how to break this to you. Like you should quit like right now, because the thing that, these other orgs had was they had like data orgs led by one person who was trusted by the CEO to do this data stuff, basically, right? And therefore, they all had a boss, and therefore they could have alignment around like, what the hell should we do? What are our priorities? Whereas me, trying to build infrastructure, trying to hire a team, I don't have time or like to understand the full context of like all the things these people need and like what I can do with like the 3 engineers I have to support the entire company. And so I did a bad job of it, because like I wasn't super good at it, and like was kind of under like fairly impossible circumstances that I think even the person who was good at it would have had a hard time with, right? There's a fun conversation going on right now, Stef, around data product managers. I don't know if you saw this one go by, data product managers. Hiring the first data product manager at Slack was like the greatest day of my life. Like it was so great.
When did that happen?
Oh, it happened honestly, ironically, right as I was kind of like conceptually like on my way out. It would have been like, God, I think it almost been like 2017. I can't like imagine. I made it like, Jesus, Steph, I made it 2 years without her. Her name's Austin Wilt. We interviewed a whole bunch of people for it. It was like one of those classic interviewing things where like you interview the first person and it turns out they're great, right? But you don't hire them because it's like literally the first person you hired. So we interviewed this wonderful woman named Deepti who's had a phenomenally great career. But it was like she was great. We're like, she's great, but like obviously we can do better. We're Slack. And like we interviewed like 20 people and they're all just like terrible. And like we let her go and she went to Uber or some shit. I'm like, no, right? It was just the worst. And then we finally found Austin, and we finally interviewed Austin. And so there's a woman named Austin Wild who I absolutely think the world of, and I don't mind embarrassing the podcast by talking about how awesome she is. And hired her to be her data product manager because like literally her first job was to unfuck the shit show of like requirements gathering failure, like what is actually important for the business across marketing, customer success, engineering, like, analytics, finance. Oh, we want to go public someday. Oh, like blah, blah, like what product, what actually do we need to do? Like what is actually important? And since I had failed to do that, it fell to her to figure that out. And I was deeply grateful for it because it made my life just infinitely better as an engineer, as an engineering manager.
That's incredible.
Right.
So that sounds like a crucial hire.
It's an absolutely crucial hire. My other sort of bit of advice would just be, if you're going to do this kind of job, and your only person you're going to have in common is like the boss of all your customers is the CEO, just make sure you're just goddamn as absolutely aligned with that CEO as humanly possible about what he or she wants from the data team. Because I wanted to build data infrastructure that Google engineers would be jealous of. That was what I wanted to do, and that was what I did. And that's sort of like why Slack still largely runs on the data infrastructure I built 6 years ago. Because like we did a good job. We built some kick-ass data infrastructure. But what Stuart really wanted to know was like right now, at this second, wherever I am on Earth, I want to know how much money is Slack making, how many seats do we have, like blah blah blah. This is actually what I care about. This is actually what I want to have happen. And I didn't do that because I'm like, oh, that's just some silly flight of fancy the CEO has. He doesn't actually need to know that. He can know it tomorrow. It's fine. Not actually true. Don't dismiss what the CEO wants because you think you know better than he does. Like why this wasn't obvious to me, I'm not sure. I'm not very smart, but I learned my lesson now. I guess I don't know. Can I blame it on being a new father and like I wasn't sleeping for 6 months and stuff? Is that I don't know if that counts. I don't know if that's a valid excuse, but just like brain dead stupid stuff. Just so stupid.
Anyway. Yeah, I think another aspect to think about that is just like when you're building the first steps of the data-driven organization, it's really difficult to thread the delicate path of like, when are you supposed to use your time to do stuff that just does not scale at all and will forever depend on, the human throughput of yourself versus trying to build something as an investment for the future.
Yes. True for every engineering manager and everyone. I think the nice thing is like I can talk to any engineering manager, engineering leader, and they can tell me no matter where they work and what field, where they are in the company, why their job is the hardest job in the world. And they kind of have a point. Like I hear about the mobile engineering problems we had at Slack. I'm like, oh my God, thank God I'm not that guy. That's horrible. And then you have like the engineering directors who are like in charge of like the core crown jewels of messaging, like which Slack is like the absolute, gold standard core of the thing. But then it's like, yeah, you have lots of resources, but what you also have is a lot of attention, like maybe too much attention. Like maybe it'd be better if Stuart paid attention to some other product for a little while so we can like get some stuff done around here. Like maybe, just maybe it'd be nice to not be the crown jewels of the company. It'd be nice to kind of be off to the side and not like have this like glare facing you all the time, right?
Excellent.
So everyone's miserable, and it's I don't know, I enjoy it. We used to do these data team lunches, like at Slack, kind of in the early days. We get everyone together, in the before times, like once a quarter, like you all go out for lunch, or you go over to like to Pinterest or Dropbox or Airbnb, whatever. We all have lunch together, and we get the data teams, we talk about our problems, and it was just an awesome exercise and think, man, thank God I am not Dropbox's data director of data engineering. Jesus Christ. This guy's just trying to keep his name note up. Oh, anyway, yeah.
That's very good. I have two follow-up questions.
Yeah.
The first one is a simple one. How big was the organization when you hired the data product manager?
Company gotten big by that point. It's a good question. I think Slack was 240 when I joined, and it was like maybe 1,200 or so when I left. So, I mean, I think I'm projecting because obviously we grew in like fits and spurts and stuff like that, right? But I want to say like 600, 700, something like that.
And do you think it should have happened sooner?
Oh, hell yeah. They should have hired her before they hired me, for the love of God. Like, oh, hell yeah. I mean, like to be building stuff in isolation with someone who doesn't, in this impossible job that's distinct from every other engineering director in the company who has like features to ship. And there's like me, I'm like over here. Okay. Yeah. Like supporting customer success and marketing and finance and, the product too, that thing.
I actually love that your answer was this, even though I'm not like I don't know if you're right that they should have hired her before you, but I'm giving a talk at DBT's conference in December. Coalesce, yeah.
Great.
And
that's awesome.
The name of the talk is "Don't Hire a Data Engineer Yet."
Yeah, that's great. I have I have a favorite tweet that's not as popular as the data scientist one, but it's the same kind of thing, which is the question I get asked all the time, which is like, should I hire a data scientist? And the answer is no, you should not. There aren't that many good ones, and I need all of them. And you should not hire a data scientist.
I at least totally agree with, one of the implicit things that you're saying there is like, it's really important to have good infrastructure, but like the first thing to solve really is like building relationships and bridging gaps between, data needs and stakeholders and all those things.
Yes, totally. And to your point, I mean, like, again, things have gotten much better. You don't need to hire me to build like, a custom version of Presto. Like, you don't need to do that anymore. You can just like swipe a credit card. It goes a long way. Credit card, reasonably smart engineer can really build you some pretty kick-ass data infrastructure these days, like with not much work. It's kind of great.
Yeah.
I mean, I like we have. I think I'm fortunate we have some very data savvy product managers. I'm pretty sure one of them could have done it like themselves. It's not that hard. I mean, I did it faster because I'm like, this is what I do. But like, they could have knocked it out in a couple weeks. It took me like a day. It would take them a couple weeks, right? Anyway, yeah.
This is probably a good segue into what are some of the things you wish existed or you wish you had back then? Or even probably now, but I know that you have already shared you're
Yeah.
sailing a dream boat right now, but can we talk a little bit about that?
I mean, I think honestly then, Steph, I dreamed of being where I am now. I think where like it was kind of funny. I remember like working with Jeff at Cloudera like back in like 2012 and us talking even back then about like, oh, thank God we don't have to think about infrastructure anymore. Like, thank God we can just like, we can start talking about problems. We can start like thinking about the data and machine learning and stuff like that. And that turned out to be like not remotely true at all for like a better part of a decade. Right. So, I mean, I feel like the world that I would wish for in 2015 is like, again, from an infrastructure perspective, is the world I live in now. So again, I am like, if like happiness is all about managing expectations, I am the world's happiest data engineer. And I think, what I wish for, inevitably, I think is the thing that I feel like I haven't like started a data tools engineering company because I kind of am like, again, I invest and I look around and I'm like, okay, this is good. Good people are building the right stuff. Like, I wish I could make them like, play nicely together and stuff. And I feel like a lot of my job is like drawing connections between things that I think are important, right? But like really like building this end-to-end semantic layer, like where it's like from the ingestion side of things, the data generation side of things, all the way through the modeling, the transformation, all the way to the visualization to the end. Like, this is what we're doing. Like, this is the world right now. And like what the right combination of pieces is, whether it's like we need the metrics layer or we need this or we need that or whatever, I'm not sure. We're figuring it out and it's super fun and it's really exciting. And like, that said, if someone said to me, Josh, we're going to figure this all out tomorrow, it's done, I'd be like, fucking great. Next problem. Like, that's awesome. That's what I want. It doesn't work that way, obviously. Like, I'm saying this now, right? Oh, thank God. Like, I don't know, Steph, what comes after the semantic layer? Like, what do we do after we're done with this layer? Like, what's next?
Yeah, those are the big questions.
It'll probably be like, again, bringing this back around to Chad Sanderson. Like, it's when we solve the semantic layer problems, it will reveal the problems that we need to solve in the next layer. And like the semantic layer needs to solve this problem of like, because the plumbing is so good, I can just do whatever I want and build my own sort of cognitive superstructure, which makes it difficult for us to work as a team and a company. So therefore, we need the semantic layer to solve that problem. And then when we solve that, it will reveal, I guess, the next problem. Because again, if you told me, yeah, Josh, in like 10 years, the data infrastructure is going to be so good that like this is going to be the problem. The problem is that everyone can create their own individual personalized data world effectively they live in. That's going to be the problem. I'd be like, yeah, sure, whatever. Yeah, I wouldn't have believed you. It would have been you sound like a crazy person.
Exactly. I do want to also just follow up with my other follow-up question, which was, you were talking about when you were talking about the data product management, and you also talked a bit about like the growth group.
Yeah.
In our last conversation, and you talked about a lot of the tooling that was developed and the processes that were developed around logging, they were sort of, I guess, developed through the growth team.
Yes.
Partially because, they needed to bridge the gap between different stakeholders.
They needed it. Absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about like what stage of the company that was at and how that developed?
So I don't know the growth story as well as I would like, in the sense that I was obviously paying attention to my own, absolute dumpster fire over in data most of the time, right? But I mean, I think to me, again, like the story of every company step is really a story of hiring, who hired when and stuff like that. I remember when we hired, like Kelly Watkins, who's now the CEO of Abstract, that leveled up. Like, so Mercy Grace led growth at Slack. She hired Kelly. Kelly was like an absolute step function raise in terms of like the quality of like our growth team, data usage, all that kind of stuff. She was just amazing. She came from that world, right? And she went on to become eventually the head of marketing at Slack. So she was like, and now she's CEO of Abstract. She's an absolute, total badass. And then Fareed Muscabat, who's he's a fellow or something at On Deck right now, helping new people start companies. He came from Zynga and Instacart, again, super data experiment driven people who were used to these logging problems and stuff. And it's it was really the thing with my with building the data infrastructure I built and like building it kind of in the early days of Slack was building like a ghost town, or like this empty city. But what I was really waiting for was these people to come. I was waiting for like the Kellys and the Farids and the engineers we hired from Google and Facebook and stuff who expected this stuff, who knew that this stuff had to exist, and they knew how to use it and they knew how to make it sing. And again, in the kind of bittersweet sense, it's like the great joy I got was seeing them use this stuff to make Slack better. Like really was like, again, even as I had like left, they were taking kind of the foundations I built and making them better and filling in the things I missed and fixing the problems I introduced and doing great stuff with it. And it was, anyway, it was an absolutely bittersweet thing to see them do such awesome stuff, but sadly not be a part of it anymore. So yeah, one of those things.
Yeah.
It's just about people. It really is about people stuff. It's about people who've been there, who've seen it done, who know how it works and can bring it with them. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
This is awesome. And this has been absolutely fantastic. I want to maybe wrap things up with just like talking a little bit about how people think about building their data cultures. For example, talking about misconceptions and what people should do to get things right, and a segue into people's biggest misconceptions about data and how data and product analytics should work together and work in general. One thing that comes to mind is what you just shared, like how people think about like what are the CEO needs versus what is the infrastructure that we need. And I want to leave it as an open question to you. Like, what do you think are people's biggest misconceptions about how data and product analytics should work or do work?
I mean, I think the biggest illusion to sort of dispel yourself of is that like the data is ever right. And I'll use just my favorite one. I think like one of the warm up questions here for this was like you're asking like what do people always get wrong in analytics? The thing I see most common is users. How many users do we have? How many users are there of Slack? Well, I have no idea. It's like how long is the coast of England? Well, it kind of depends on how you measure it, right?
Exactly.
That's the biggest misconception. I think that people operate under some sort of Platonic ideal where it is possible to like actually determine how many humans used our product today, and it just isn't. It's just not. And kind of back to like the idea of like the trusting data stuff, like I think the problem people have is they go in naively assuming that like there is a concrete answer to this question of like how many users do we have, because it seems like the kind of thing it's like pretty straightforward, right? It's like how many people use it. It doesn't seem like this should be so hard. And when they find out that it's not actually easy and it's basically in fact pretty goddamn near impossible to actually figure this out, they are very much disheartened and disillusioned, and they trust nothing, and they kind of go to like they go way existential. Nihilism, whatever, like they're done with all this stuff, right? And then the kind of the galaxy brain thing, because it's just all we speak in memes these days, right? Is figuring out, yes, this is wrong, and yes, it's a lie, and yes, there's all these problems with it, but we still got to use it to make progress, and figuring out like how to understand the limitations of this thing and still make progress with it despite them to make things better for everybody. That's the enlightenment moment. But it's hard, and not everyone gets there and stuff. A lot of people are just like, yeah, fuck this. We can't possibly know. So like, let's just ship features basically. And that's the thing.
Yeah. This is the perfect segue into, I think, what I want to maybe leave our audience with, which is just like, well, okay. And that's very disheartening. And I agree. And I've seen so many people go through that. What do you think is the first thing teams should do to start getting their analytics right?
I mean, the first thing I did at Slack, the very first thing I did, which I did an okay job of, but did not do. And I'm not here to shill for Avo, although anyway, was introduce like evolvable logging, schematized logging. And I said in my very first week at Slack, I got everyone together and said, here you go. There's Avra, there's protocol buffers, there's Thrift. We're going to pick one of these things. And from here on out, this format is the only thing we will accept in the data warehouse. We will not ingest anything that doesn't come with a schema with types. And we're building this, and it's designed to be evolved, and it'll have all this tooling, and it will impose all this cost on everyone forever who wants to write anything to the data warehouse. It's not a free-for-all. It's not JSON anymore. But it will pay dividends for the company basically forever in ways that you can't appreciate. Like Slack right now can go back and reprocess the application logs from 2015 whenever they want. They can just do that. They always can, whenever they want to. It's amazing, right? Not a lot of companies can say that, I assure you. That's the most important thing. That was the very first thing I did, Stef. Like literally, like providing that foundation, that container. And I think that's exciting about the new world we're entering is like Avo exists, and you can do a much better job of it than I did because you can impose not just structure and syntax, but like semantics in a lot of ways around these things, which is exciting to me. It makes me very happy. That's the most important thing. If you get that, I don't know. Jeff once told me about managing. He said, if you hire the right people and you motivate them properly, you can do everything else in management wrong and you'll still be okay. But if you don't get those two things right, you can do everything else wrong and it won't matter. You're still screwed. And I feel like in many ways, like my career is like a living embodiment of that principle. Like that to the extent that anything I did right, it was because I hired well and I motivated people because I did literally everything else wrong. And that's how I feel about like the modern data stack stuff, like, which is if you get serious early, even more serious than I was about committing to structured logging, committing to like strong semantics around this stuff, it will pay dividends for you. I know it's not free. I know it kind of sucks. It will pay dividends for you forever and ever and ever. Like your future use, like will thank you. And so that's actually not true. They'll still hate you for the few decisions you made. But never mind. They won't appreciate you. But I will appreciate you. I will see you. It's actually my favorite thing to do in data conversations with people is talk about this stuff because the data people get it. They know how great it is because they've lived the pain and suffering of not having it that way. So anyway, that's the most important thing to get right. It really is.
Excellent. I think those are great final words. I want to thank you so much for taking the time. It was amazing.
Thanks for having me.
It's been super insightful. I know that this is just number one. It's so good to get the validation that you're not alone in the world. But I also know that everything that you're sharing is super valuable for so many people that are not only just starting their journey, but also on their journey and trying to do things better. So Thank you. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Right Track. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Keep the conversation going with us in the Right Track community. Join us on therighttrack.avo.app. You can learn more about Avo at avo.app, and please follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter via AvoHQ.